was Australia's greatest all-rounder, lethal with the ball, a swashbuckler with the bat. He had the manner and the bearing of a boy's own hero. He was bold and brilliant and cared little for authority. Instinctive and unpredictable, Keith Miller is one of ESPN's legends of cricket. Lord's 1956. At the age of 36, Keith Miller, leading a much weakened Australian attack, returned his best ever test match bowling figures.
Lord's in 1956 was Miller's greatest performance, as far as I was concerned.
The hero of the match being congratulated by Neil Harvey.
We desperately needed to win at Lord's. We lost Lindwall with a torn muscle. Pat Crawford, who came into the side, tore a muscle in the first morning, bowled 5 overs, and it looked as though we were deep in trouble, and Miller bowled a long time in both innings, took 5 wickets in each innings, 10 in the match, and swung the game for us and won it. For me, that you have Botham's match in 1981. For me, that was Miller's match.
Australia have won by 185 runs.
Miller at Lord's in 56 produced his greatest bowling performance in Test cricket, and perhaps a bit ironic that it came in his final Test series, but Miller as a Test bowler I think had grown through his career, and it was a great performance. He carried the Australian side. It was the one victory in the series that the Australian side achieved.
As a bowler, Miller was famously unpredictable.
He could bowl as quick as anybody that was around in those days. He didn't always bowl that quick, but and every now and again, of course, he used to just wheel. He only ran 13 paces or 15 paces, but he used to just come and wheel, and he'd come, and then all of a sudden he'd get a skip in his run. He'd muck it up so much that he'd bowl a wrong and out of the back of his hand or a leg break or something. He was just that unpredictability that he had that was part of his genius.
Keith Miller, when he wanted to be, was the most devastating bowler of the time and capable of winning a match in a couple of overs. Miller had a short run. He had a very explosive action, and he was probably as quick. His quickest ball was probably as quick as anyone at the time, and also a very nasty bouncer.
Miller's batting was founded on forward play. He was a master of the drive.
I saw him score 200 against Queensland in Brisbane. Absolutely incredible innings. He came down to Sydney, and we played the Englishmen here in Sydney in the first match of one of the early matches of the tour. And I can still remember Keith, he got another 200 in that game. I'm not joking, straight drove Alec Betts a first bounce, a first ball with a second new ball, straight back over his head at first bounce into the showground wall. And it went like a 2-iron shot. Like Tiger Woods couldn't hit a 2-iron better. It was absolutely the most incredible shot.
If he hadn't been a bowler, he would have been one of the really great batsmen. Miller was mercurial as a batsman. He played very correctly, but he had this attacking outlook, and he was tall, with his reach, he could get at practically anything, and he could hit 4s off really good bowling. And he could have been a master batsman, Miller.
Miller was also a captain of imagination and flair.
Miller was, to me, a legend. He was someone I copied. I thought he was the best cricketer, best captain never to captain Australia. And he was someone who was an instinctive captain. He taught me a great deal on the field when he was captain of New South Wales.
When he was appointed captain of New South Wales, and it was Bobby Simpson who told me the story. And Simpson had just come from Western Australia to play for New South Wales, and it was going to be his first match. And Miller was leading the team down on the field, and Simpson was there, and suddenly the gate man apparently said to Miller, "Mr. Miller, you're taking 12 men onto the field." He goes, "Would one of you gentlemen kindly mind leaving the field?" He didn't put it in quite those words.
Keith Miller was the first sex symbol of cricket. He had the Brill Cream advertisement with the hair, and whenever he used to get the Brill Cream in the hair, he used to throw it back, and all the girls used to swoon. Like, he was just everything. He was a bomber pilot, fought in the Battle of Britain. He was a fast bowler. He was one of the biggest hitters the game's ever seen. He was a big dude, 6'3". He played Aussie rules football for St Kilda. He did everything. He was everyone's dream.
In February 1938, at the age of 18, Keith Miller played his first match for Victoria. He scored 181, but he might have been a Victorian hero in another sport.
He was a great Australian rules football player down in Melbourne, and he's regarded down there as one of the stars of that era. So he was an athlete. I think that's the best thing. He could probably put his hand to anything he tried.
Oh, he was a magnificent athlete. If you ever saw him kick a football, the same as hitting a golf ball. Like, he'd hit a golf ball like miles out of any further than anybody you could ever imagine. He was just the most complete natural athlete.
By the time first-class cricket was shut down by the war in 1941, Miller had played 14 first-class matches for 2 centuries, but he'd bowled just 7 overs for 1 wicket. Miller served with distinction as a fighter pilot during World War II. By the time he was drafted into the Australian Services team for the post-war victory tests, he'd become a new ball bowler.
When cricket fans in Australia heard that he was taking wickets in the victory tests in England in 1945, they must have thought it was a different Keith Miller, because the Miller before the war was not a bowler. But so the story goes, Miller was basically thrown the ball during the victory tests at practice and said, "Here, have a bowl." And he then responded with some of the quickest spells ever seen and was very quickly opening the bowling.
By the end of that series, Miller had become the golden boy of Australian cricket.
Keith Miller was my idol as a cricketer growing up. I'd go to the ground with my father, and Martin would say to me, "Watch Miller, look what Miller's doing," you know. And Miller was a very easy guy to watch. He was very flamboyant, he was big and strong, and he had a great build, he was very athletic. So I used to love watching him.
When I eventually got to speak to Keith Miller a few times, it was towards the end of his career. And I've got to tell you that I was fascinated. I sat down with him a few times and I just couldn't, every word was golden. He was obviously getting ill at that stage, and one got the feeling that he wouldn't last. He lasted a lot longer than we all thought. He must have been a pretty tough bloke.
K.R. Miller is the most vivacious sportsman of any sport I've ever seen anywhere, ever. And he's my hero. He's the hero of all the kids of my generation. I remember, when I was a kid and I had hair, I used to do what Miller did, flick your hair back every time, And when you went out to bat, you pull on the batting does with your teeth, as Miller did. The sight of Miller coming down to bat at Lord's, just walking out there was fantastic. And he could do one or two things. He could get naught, or he could get 164 at high speed. And it didn't worry him. And I got to know Keith very well later, because we were going on to cricket tours together. And you talked to him about this, and he said, "Look, those test matches, I don't know why they take them all so seriously." And the reason was he'd been a night fighter pilot in the war over Europe. Now, your life expectancy there was about 3 weeks during that game. And he crashed once and he got away with it, and he lived through it. And he came back. I don't think he ever worried about anything like that ever again in his life.
Keith Miller made his Ashes debut in 1946-47 against the touring Englishman. In his first match, he made 79 and took 7 for 60 in the first innings. He scored his maiden century, 141 not out, in the 4th test.
In the first test of that series on a wet track in Brisbane, he took 7 wickets. This was after he'd scored 79 with the bat. He then scored 100 in Adelaide. Immediately, a new star was born. It was tell he was a major figure he was going to be a major figure in international cricket.
He's the best all-rounder we've produced in this country in my time. I think he probably could have made a few more runs if he felt inclined. I don't think he really pushed himself to the extent that he might have done as a batsman. But get his dander up with the ball in his hand, he was probably as dangerous a fast bowler as I've seen.
By now, Miller with Ray Lindwall had formed one of the greatest fast bowling combinations in history.
Almost a perfect bowling combination. Lindwall accurate, very quick, never giving anything away, and Miller at the other end, more mercurial. They fed off each other. Lindwall could take wickets, but he'd also keep them quiet. Batsmen would be inclined, because Miller was a bit looser, to think they could get away with something, score runs off Miller, but the fact that Lindwall had kept them quiet made them more inclined to take chances against Miller and hence more inclined to get out.
Ray was the best bowler I ever saw of any type, and his control and everything was just was perfect. And when you think about it, at the other end you had, Miller, who was unpredictable. You just didn't know what was going to come next. And really, it's a perfect team.
Keith and Ray were great pals. They worked in unison. They were different types of personalities. Keith was a more volatile character, and Keith, of course, was a better batsman than Ray. Keith was an outstanding bowler. And at times, when he was in the mood, Keith could be an absolutely devastating fast bowler as well. But it was better to use him in relatively short bursts, give him 3 or 4 hours at a time. Keith was also an outstanding slip field, and he too was one of the great all-rounders that's played the game. Marvellous cricketer.
In 1947, Keith Miller moved to Sydney to play for New South Wales. He would become the most popular Victorian ever to transfer his loyalties north.
Keith Miller in the 1950s was the pride of Sydney, and when New South Wales won 9 Sheffield Shields on the trot, Miller, who of course doesn't even have a toilet named after him at the SCG, as he's ready to point out, was the hero. But none of us kids dared try to emulate him because he was too big. He was a god.
The 1948 tour of England, famous as Bradman's last campaign, was fraught with difficulty for Miller.
The expectations on Miller on that tour were huge because he'd been so successful in the victory tests. And I don't think he lived up to those standards. Well, I didn't live up to his own high standards anyway.
In 1948, Miller was having some problems with his back. I also think that it was probably all a bit too easy for Miller that tour. He would have played better cricket if there'd been more of a challenge. And I think the fact that they were winning easily all the time, and they were winning against, playing against people who were Miller's friends, Edrich and Compton and those people, he liked them, they were his friends. He probably didn't enjoy the easy victories against people that he liked.
By now, Miller was, in his own way, almost as popular as the Don himself. But he was by no means Bradman's favourite cricketer.
I think the relationship between Miller and Bradman was always uneasy. Miller was very easygoing, and I think Bradman probably disapproved of that to an extent. And there were a couple of instances in England when Bradman asked Miller to bowl, and Miller had a bad back and threw the ball back to him. Then later on after the war, in a testimonial match, Miller bowled a number of bouncers at Bradman, which Bradman obviously didn't appreciate.
In the 1950-51 Ashes series, Miller took 17 wickets and topped the batting averages, making an unbeaten century in Adelaide. He scored another century against the West Indies the following season and twice took 5 wickets in an innings.
Miller was at his greatest as an all-rounder, I think, in the early 50s. I think he came back to Australia after the 48 tour and didn't have a very successful 48-49 series in Australia, to the point that he was left out of the Australian team to South Africa in 49-50, but he went over there as a late replacement when Bill Johnston was hurt in a car crash, and went very well in South Africa. So then we had reaffirmed his spot in the side for the 50-51 Ashes tour, and he was Australia's leading player in that summer, and then followed up against the West Indies the season after, and that was where he really established his reputation, I think.
Miller was the star of a very good Australian team in that period. And the great thing about the early 50s is that England had just as good a team. So you saw Miller at his best, competing, and you saw some very good cricket.
In 1955 against the West Indies, Miller once again stole the show. He made 3 Test match centuries, including his highest Test score of 147 in Kingston.
Miller loved the West Indies. He loved being there, and he loved playing against them. I think the West Indies cricketers had more in common with Keith Miller than a lot of the Australian or English cricketers. There's an image of the West Indies cricketers as sort of carefree Caribbean cricketers, but they played at home in a very hard school, and the competition within the West Indies was very hard, very tough. And I think Miller liked that.
After Miller's match-saving 10 wickets at Lord's in 1956, Australia suffered heavy defeats in the 3rd and 4th Tests. There was media speculation that Miller might replace Ian Johnson as Australian captain.
To me, it's insane that Miller was never captain of Australia. I mean, purely in terms of cricketing nous and cricketing ability, he was so clearly the obvious choice to be Australia's captain after Lindsay Hassett retired. And instead, the Australian selectors chose Ian Johnson as captain.
Miller would certainly have been a more inspiring captain than Ian Johnson, but Johnson had all the attributes of solidity and reliability that Miller didn't have. The fact that Johnson was chosen over Miller might well be a reflection of Bradman's preference for reliability than sort of the volatile aspect that Keith Miller brought to the game.
Their Majesties invited the Australian cricketers to tea at the castle. Here the Queen is talking to Miller.
Probably the fact that, when you toured England, there was so much speech making to be made, all that sort of thing. And really, I couldn't imagine Keith probably could have done it, but I think it would have been a real effort.
If those in power were sceptical about Miller's suitability for the captaincy, those who played under him in domestic cricket had no such doubts. Miller captained New South Wales with imagination and flair, never reckless, but often bold, prepared to risk defeat in order to win. And from time to time, the cavalier came to the fore.
Well, Miller was very good. He was short on words. Sometimes I've been with Miller when he's walked out onto the field with the New South Wales side, and he'll look around to find who's in the team. And once I heard him say, just find yourself Scudder. And that was it. But move 1 yard out of position on the field, and you'd get a nod to get back there. He's very, very quick to sense what was going right and wrong, and he was a fine captain.
Miller did not play another Test after 1956. He retired from all cricket in 1959. He left behind memories of astounding performances and an attitude to cricket and to life that has made him one of the most beloved figures in the game.
Keith Miller's modern day comparison would probably be a bit like probably Shane Warne. I know they're different type of players, but everyone had an opinion about both of them. When they walked in the room, they had this air about them. They had this, this wonderful knowing that he's a sign of greatness.
He was, I suppose, if you look at film stars, he was the Errol Flynn of cricket. He just loved adventure, Like he batted aggressively, he bowled aggressively, and I think it was that manner that he had, that ability, this freakish ability to do things. But to him it was so simple, yet to the normal mortal it was impossible.
Keith Miller, he was a great fast bowler, terrific batsman, very good slip spinner, also a good Australian rules footballer, but also a great visionary. And I can remember reading a book, I think it was called From the Grandstand, which he wrote in the late 50s. And Keith Miller at that time said, what cricket really needs, in addition to Test cricket, a 5-day game, is a shorter version of the game. And of course now we have limited over cricket. And even back in the mid-50s and late 50s, Keith Miller he could see that cricket needed something else just to give it an oomph along. And that's what, back then he could see one-day cricket was essential to make cricket really viable all around the world. Great visionary.
Would have been a marvellous one-day cricketer, because there you got two for the price of one. A good batsman, a good bowler, and a good hitter of the ball. When in that one-day stuff, the ball going up all the time because he got to pitch up to him. He was tall and he was able to drive brilliantly. And as a bowler, it's one of the greatest bowlers I've ever seen.
Keith Miller played in 55 Test matches. He made 2,958 runs at an average of 36.98, including 7 centuries. He took 170 wickets at an average of 22.98. His bowling average places him amongst the greatest of fast bowlers. He took 38 catches.
Keith Miller was an all-rounder of tremendous charisma, a personality of tremendous charisma and a wonderfully generous heart, incidentally, who, when he really wanted to turn it on, was a match winner with bat or ball.
Keith was a marvellous person in a team. I remember breaking my ankle very badly and dislocating the ankle off the foot. And I went back to London and I had to have treatment for about 7 or 8 weeks with getting treatment every day. Keith would come back and the first door he'd knock on was my door to see how I was getting on. And, little things like that are very personal.
He loved playing at Lord's. Lord's is a big thing for him. He loved the English life. He really enjoyed the English people's company. He got shot down 6 times as a bomber pilot. And if you can imagine back then, the bomber pilot's lives only averaged 3 months in the war. And he got through the whole lot of it and still played cricket. And he thought nothing about pressure playing for your country. Pressure is only having 1/4 of a tank in your fighter plane or in your bomber plane and having 3 Messerschmitts on your backside trying to shoot you down. Now that's pressure.
Did everything that you would expect a long-standing pilot of the war to do once the war's over, namely that life was put into perspective a little bit more than most other people can ever get that sort of view of it, and played his game, batting, bowling, fielding, on the field, off the field, as though tomorrow would never ever come, and if it did, then okay, we'll try again.
As a man, Keith Miller is flamboyant and larger than life. As a cricketer, he was singularly gifted and wonderfully entertaining. He holds a special place in the ranks of ESPN's legends of cricket.